Wonderful to see you all here. My name is Cindy Haken. I'm the Reader Advisory Librarian at the library, along with Leah Farrow, the Adult Services Programming Librarian at the library. We welcome you to our first author event. We checked this since January of 2020 in person. I'm going to start with a little story. In the early summer of 2021, 3 different people came to see me within the space of a couple of weeks to tell me about a book called Girls of Tender Age. The 3 people are in this room, and they all said to me, "You have to read this book, and this would be a great book club book. This would be a great, is there any way we could get her to come and talk to us? This book is amazing." And the first person who said it, I was like, okay. The second person that said it, I said, huh. And when the third person told me, I said, this is ridiculous. And I emailed Marianne, and you can do that. People can offer, oh my God, I don't know how. And I went on her website, and this was her email address, and I emailed her, and she wrote back within 90 minutes and said, I'd love to come and talk to you about the book. And it's been getting a lot of interest for reasons, resurgence of interest for reasons that I'm sure she's going to talk about. And so then I went to one of the 3 people who had urged me to consider the book and said, we used to have this nonfiction book club, and it went on hiatus, and I really want to start it back up, and I think you should lead it, and I have a great idea for your first book. And so the library's nonfiction book club met last Thursday for the first time since the pandemic. Susan Gomes is our new moderator, and we had an amazing discussion of Girls of Tender Age. And many of the people who attended that meeting are here on Zoom or in the room, because everyone was just so engrossed in the story and are so excited to meet Marianne. Let me just give you, anyone who's read the book already pretty much knows her biography, but briefly, she was born and raised, as you know, in Hartford, and for all of her life until 5 years ago, she lived in Connecticut, except for 2 years when she served in the Peace Corps as a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon. As she describes so powerfully in the book, her brother Tyler was autistic and had a library of over 2,000 books on World War II military history. She said that her relationship with her brother was one of the 3 core influences on her writing, the other 2 being the poetry and prose that her father read to her at bedtime, which I love, and the shelf of classics children's literature that her mother had assembled for her at home. Marianne, after she finished the Peace Corps, she taught and worked as a librarian, so I'm even more excited about her. And she worked as her first freelance writing job was for Reader's Digest. I'm sure many of us remember that periodical very fondly. She's taught fiction and memoir writing, and in addition to Girls of Tender Age, she's the author of 3 novels in the Poppy Rice Mystery series, a Red Sox Mystery called Dirty Water, co-written with her son Tomorrow, and 5 additional novels, and has 2 books in progress. 5 years ago, she moved, the way she describes it, a half block from the Gulf of Mexico on a barrier island off of Fort Myers with her beach-loving family and a Labradoodle who's adorable. If you go on the website and see, named Salty. So Marianne's going to talk to us for about 45 minutes. We'll take questions after that, and then she'll be signing copies of the book. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Marianne.
Thank you very much. Am I off center?
Wrestling against the house.
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, good. All right. So I want to tell you that libraries have always been my refuge, and librarians my heroes, and I'm so glad to be back in a library. I wanted to recognize my beautiful and wonderful daughter, Jenny, who drove me here tonight and ran into a CVS and got me a bottle of water on the way. Thank you, Jenny. She's my greatest fan and my best friend. And I also want to recognize Laurie Baumhart in the back of the room, who is the manager of the Yukon Barnes and Noble bookstore in downtown Hartford. We hear a lot about chains and how awful they can be. Well, they don't have Lori Baumhart, who has turned that library into an intimate, personal community library. And a few years back, she did a whole presentation reintroducing girls of tender age to the city of Hartford, which gave it a really great boost. And of course, I appreciate it so much, Lori. The other thing I wanted to tell you, again, as to why librarians are my heroes, but I'm not theirs, I think, after what I did to poor Cindy here. I contacted her a couple of days ago and I said, well, I'll see you on Tuesday. But I forgot to there were many hours of what did we do? How we gonna change everything? So I said, it's all my fault. I take full responsibility. The poor people thought, what kind of a nitwit we have coming to our library tonight. So here I am. Okay, so I'd like to talk about how Girls of Tender Age came about. I was interviewed by the Hartford Current, one of many kinds of interviews that writers do. And out of the blue, and I don't know why, I found myself speaking about a time when I was 9 years old. And when my 5th grade classmate, my neighbor, and my good friend, Irene Peterwitz, was raped and strangled, her body found in a yard just a few houses down from me. So we went to school that morning, and the rumor was that Irene had been kidnapped. And people are saying, she's probably out of school because she had a cold. Because every morning we would play double dutch, and she was one of the chief jumpers. And so we went up to our classroom, and our teacher, Miss Bowie, normally rushing around, pinning things up, doing all the things that teachers do, was standing there like this in the door. And she said, it was December, go to the cloakroom. Many of you might remember cloakrooms, many of you might be too young. And leave off your boots and your coats and your hats and sit down. And she just watched us do that. And then she said, once we were sitting down, we will never speak of Irene again. This was the big speech. You didn't speak about such things. If you didn't talk about it, if you didn't think about it, it would just go away. So a custodian came in. He took Irene's desk out of the row, and he took it out of the room, and we all moved up. So that was our introduction to something so horrible that many of us from that school to this day have not gotten over this. Some people just left Hartford and never came back, but mostly the things that occurred happened because we didn't know what happened. No one talked to us about it. So I knew I wanted to write this story when I was talking to the Hartford Current about this. This had come out of the blue. I hadn't thought about Irene in all of those years because I was supposed to not think about her. So I knew I wanted to write a story, a novel, of course, but I felt a novel would be exploitative. And I didn't want to exploit Irene, and I didn't really know what to do. I knew so little of the truth of what had happened, and realized too, I wasn't interested in making anything up. As a novelist, that's what we do. We make things up. We're professional liars. And imagination is everything. So I wasn't sure where I was going to progress with this, but I was working on other books at the time. And then the Current editor called me after the interview came out, and she said that she had a phone call, and it was from Irene's brother. And he wanted to speak to me. She said, I'm giving you his number. And he said, if she calls me, good, and if she doesn't, I understand. So my heart, turned over in my chest. I did want to speak to him, but what was I going to say? And I didn't know him. He was 7 years older than Irene. So I called, and he ran a business on the Berlin Turnpike called Fred's Auto Body. So I called the number, and someone said, Fred's Auto Body. And I said, hi, is this Fred? No, can I get him for you? Who's calling? And I said, yes, I'd like to speak to him. This is Mary Ann Tirone Smith returning his call. It was his bad side. Then all of a sudden, hold on. Fred's her. And so he came to the phone and he said, I didn't think anyone remembered my sister. No one's ever mentioned her to me. And now here you are thinking about her and talking to the current about her and bringing up these along with the bad stuff. You mentioned some sweet things about my sister that I remember too, and I really want to thank you. So I was pretty overwhelmed, and in the end, Fred and I kept in touch. And I think it was almost as if we developed a brother-sister relationship. His sister was gone, and my brother, the indefatigable Tyler, was out of the range of the normal brother, you know, who goes to Trinity College, frat brothers. Cool. That didn't happen. So we just really hit it off and became friends until the point came when he said to me, you know, my sister doesn't have a marker in the cemetery. He's buried in what is essentially Potter's Field. And her mother was a single mom. They lived in the same housing project I did, Charter Oak Terrace, except that we managed to get out and buy homes, and Irene's mother did not. And so I decided in speaking with him at that point, because that's when he started talking about his goal in life was to get his sister a marker, and he designed it and what it was going to look like. It's beautiful stone. And he said, will you come to the cemetery with me and see if we can find her? So I did. And so at what's the Catholic cemetery in Blue Hills Elm? Oh, I could forget the big cemetery.
St. Benedict?
St. Benedict, yeah, thank you. So so we go and we talk to the man in charge, and he said in those days they had a little round circle, a piece of rounded cement with a number, but over the years with the upheaval of the frost line and everything, it got lost. So he gave us a map to follow, gave us some landmarks, and we got to this point, and we just started digging around, and we found it with her number. So then we went back, and he said, I want to have a stone. And he said, well, because of where this is, it has to be a flat stone. It can't be one that rises up. So that was all right with Fred. He said, okay. And meanwhile, me, who gets furious at the drop of a hat, you know, if I'm not furious once a week, I died. You know. Fred, you know, your sister belonged to St. Lawrence O'Toole's church. That's my church. And because she was from an old Polish family, she also belonged to St. Cyrus and Methodius. How come one of those churches didn't get her a stone? And something I will never understand. So anyway, or as my father was told, when he went collecting after the cathedral burned down in Hartford, to everybody on the street, he got 3 streets, and it was now in Catholics, but all the families. So 3 doors down, his buddy, who was not a Catholic, said, come on in, Mo, have a drink. And he said, listen, tell the Pope to pry a ruby out of his crown and build a cathedral. I'm not hanging up here. So, okay, so anyway, he did have this beautiful stone with an angel carved in it, and her name. And so, when it was all set, we went to see it. And when we went, he had 2 yellow roses. And so we got to the grave, and it was beautiful. And we said our prayer, and he put the tulip down. And my brother had died just a few years before that. And he said, should we go visit Tyler's grave? And I said, that would be wonderful, you know? And we did. We said the yellow rose, the other one. Oh, such a sweetheart, I cannot begin to tell you. Okay, so when I decided, here's what I decided. What I need to do is write a memoir. Everybody else is writing memoirs. I might as well do it too. And I'll do some research and find out what happened. I don't know who killed her. I didn't know anything about this. And I said, I know all of the 50s and I knew all about the community, and I have to find out about this and write what happened. So all those who know nothing will know exactly what happened and maybe move on past it. So, so when I was researching in the main library in downtown Hartford, and again, these librarians, when I told them what I was doing, not only were they stacking a table with all of this stuff they kept bringing me, they had to wheel out another table, you know. And today, sometimes you're in the library and you're looking for something, and so they Google it, and you say, I just Googled it, there's nothing there. So anyway, I was going through everything, and I was going through the old currents in Hartford Times, and I found an article about this big, describing a young girl, a Buckley student, who went to the police to say that she had been raped. And I'm reading about it, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, now this was a week before Irene was killed. This is very strange. And she lived right in our neighborhood. So her father called the police. The officer came to their home, completely humiliated her. She had been raped and strangled and survived. And she had strangulation marks around her neck. And the police officer said to her, do you have a boyfriend? And insinuated that those were hickeys, you know. So, and this is how victims of rape to this day are treated, I have to say. And so, anyway, her father threw him out. He called the police chief the next day. And so the police chief apologized. He said, my daughter's been injured, she's been hurt, and she's been raped by this man. And the chief was really sympathized and was as kind as he could be. And then 1 week after that, Pidgey woke up to see the Hartford Current headlines. The Current was delivered to your door. Hartford girl murdered. And Irene's picture was on the front. She starts reading it, and she knew this was the guy who did to her what he done. So they called the police again. Police invited them downtown, and she gave them all the details she could come up with. She wanted to get that guy. She was 16 years old, and because another girl was murdered, and she could have prevented that murder if the police had listened to her, she was ready to just do it all herself. Just incredible kid. And so the police arrested somebody based on her information. Details like a pack of Lucky Strikes fell out of his pocket, so they knew he smoked them. And everything else that she could think of. And so they arrested a suspect. So she was asked to come to headquarters and look at him and look at a lineup and see if she could pick him out. And she did do that, and she did pick him out. And then they said to her, what will really help us is go into a room with him and listen to his voice and be sure that that was the voice of the man who attacked her. And they explained to her they were desperate because they couldn't get a confession out of him. They never did. But all that she could do to help would help them. He wasn't arrested yet. So, he was a suspect. So her father said, no, this is enough. You cannot ask this kid to do that. Absolutely not. I will not let her into a room with a monster. He said, let me into a room. So, there was two police women in Hartford at the time. They were basically meter maids. But to comfort Irene, that she had one of the women there. And so she said, you know, I think you can do this. I think what we'll do is have the officer in the room with the suspect, and we will have the officer ask him a question. And we'll have the door open a tiny bit so we can hear this. And when he starts to answer, Pidgey, I will have my arm around you. Step 1 foot into that room, you listen, and I'll take you right back out. And she said, Dad, that's what I'm. And she did. And she came out and she got already identified him in the lineup, and she said, that's the one. And when the police were able to start threatening him with things like that, you know, we've got a witness, we've got this and that, you know, this, that. Well, you know, that girl winked it. She's 11 years old. Mm-hmm. So he was just the worst of the worst. And anyway, they got him. So now I write the book. It was a great success, mostly because of librarians, people like Lori Hart, who promoted this book, and most of all, book clubs. They just ate it up. There was a really good book club question and answer thing in the back, and it was a good one. I think that helped a lot. So, and then because I was from Connecticut, everybody was inviting me to come to their book club meetings. So I would go to book. I love book club meetings. I live in a cave, you know. I'm writing with 4 walls around me, and then I actually get to go out with this and see people and talk to them and talk about the book. And I enjoyed doing that very much. And then out of the blue, I got an email. The subject line. Did I say that we called her Pidgey DeLassio? That was the name I gave her because I was not going to use her real name. And there was no finding her at the time I wrote this book. So, so that's the only name in the book that's not a real name. So the subject line said, I am Pidgey DeLassio's son. And this is what he wrote. My wife and I have just finished listening to the audiobook, Girls of Tender Age. I want to thank you for writing it. It's affected me deeply and my understanding of who my mother is. I first learned of Robert Mom, who was the killer, a few years ago when I was searching my mother's maiden name, hoping to find her in the newly publicized 1940 census. My mother and her family never mentioned Mom or any involvement with this case. In some very profound ways, my mother has remained a teenager her whole life. I now understand why her development was stifled. She is now 84 years old and will answer my questions about this terrible time directly and eerily without the emotions one would expect. I'm pretty sure she distanced herself from emotions. She lost normal emotions all those years ago. I hope it is rewarding for you to know how impactful your work is and how telling Irene's story continues to heal generations who weren't even born at the time of her murder. With gratitude and admiration, and signed Joe. So with that, I started to get into the fact that Pidgey, there was a reward offered by Governor Lodge, and it was for $3,000 for anything leading to the arrest of Robert Mom. And so Pidgey claimed the reward. So the judge at the time denied the reward. She was denied this reward because the Governor Lodge offered it 3 days after Pidgey went to the police. And he said, a reward is a contract. And she did not abide, said this to her, and you did not abide by the terms of the contract. Never mind that the lineup and all the talking to the police happened days after of the reward. So this is Judge Baldwin. And I have a friend who commutes between Old Saybrook and East Haven who tells me he spits on that bridge every single day. So now, Pidgey family appealed. So that didn't work. So this is what Baldwin said during the appeal. It is the duty of a citizen to do what you did. And your reward should come of your doing your duty as a citizen. You should be satisfied with that. Absolutely boggling. So I said, I'm getting a reward for that woman. I'm doing it for her family. I'm getting it. I'm getting it. So took 2 years. And interestingly, I wrote to everybody out of nowhere. And I wrote to the dean of the Berkeley Law School, who is one of the people who utterly debunked the argument that the judge used not to get her the reward. There's a whole legal explanation of this, of what he used. There's a name for it. It's called plain terms. You abide by the plain terms of the contract. It wasn't, and the reward is not a contract, by the way. It's not a business contract. So anyway, I wrote to him. I said, could you support me in this? I want to get this woman this reward that she deserves. And he said to me, I sympathize with you. It's a very awful story. It's terrible what happened to her. Here's the problem. The Connecticut General Assembly cannot overturn the legislative branch, cannot overturn the judicial branch's decision. It just doesn't happen. It can't happen. Oh, but it happened. It happened because there's a man named Ed Vargas who represents the Hartford district where Pidgey and Irene and I grew up. He was the only one who responded positively. When he got my letter, he just called me up and he said, we're going for this. So it went right through until a few weeks ago when Governor Lamont signed the bill that Ed Vargas introduced into law. So books change lives. Girls of tender age change lives. Governor of the state of Connecticut. The pen. An act requiring the payment of a reward to Patricia Pidgey DeLesio. Be it enacted by the Senate, House of Representatives, General Assembly convened. Section 1, effective from the passage, notwithstanding any provision of Chapter 53 of the General Statutes, the governor shall order payment in the amount of $3,000 from the general fund to the individual who provided information on December 11th, 1953, that led to the identification and arrest and conviction of Robert Nelson Mom for the murder of 11-year-old Irene Friederwitz of Hartford, pursuant to the reward offered on December 14th, 1953, in accordance with Section 8269 of the 1949 revision of the General Statutes. Ed Vargas did his research. Approved June 20th, 2021, and Lamont signed it, and he had a wonderful, wonderful public ceremony in the Capitol. Lori was there, you know, the flags all around, the whole thing. And my grandson, Christopher, came to take a video, and then Lamont recognized him, which was very nice of him. And then my grandson said afterward, we took a field trip in the 8th grade to Washington. I didn't see anything like this. I didn't see any kind of ceremony like this. This was incredible. He was so impressed that really made me feel especially great. But you'll notice in here that there is some, excuse me, son of a bitch who got in here the notation that her identification came before the date of the offer of the reward. So I'm going after this guy. I'm going to write about this, and I'm going to name his name because his heart is made of ice. And to say nothing of the 3 senators who voted against the bill. You know, when the House, I did the Zoom, and they have this huge board, and each one votes. But they don't vote there at their desks. They go and do it on their computers. And all you do is watch this giant board. And I'm watching the Y's for yes and the N for nay. And it was Y, all over it till it was done. It was unanimous. So the 3 senators who voted nay, this is incredible. They said, there are a lot of people who deserve justice who didn't get it. And it's not fair to them that they didn't. And Edward said, oh, so let's throw this Pigeon D'Alessio under the bus to make a point. I don't know what I'll have to do when their next election comes up, but they're going to lose the election. They're not coming back. They don't represent the people of Connecticut that I know. So that said, I thought I was just going to do one more thing to give you a taste of the other side of this memoir, which is growing up in Hartford, what life was like in the 50s, and how much fun it was. So this is just a paragraph. I brought to everyone I know in Hartford that we spend all summer at a cottage near Catherine Hepburn's house, which is true, except for the near part. I'm told I am putting on airs. The community in Old Saybrook, where Catherine Hepburn lives, Fenwick, is 3 miles away. The houses there are sprawling turn-of-the-century behemoths with wide porches, turrets, and gardens. Our cottage is in Chalker Beach, a community of seasonal shacks. Improved. Life is improved. When my father and I are in town buying salami at the butcher's, sometimes we see Catherine, and my father says, hey, how you doing, Kate? And she says, I'm just fine, young fella. She's the same age as my father. She never really looks at him, and she chooses not to see me either. I just wanted to give you a little taste of that part of it. So, let's see. I know. If you want to write your own memoir, everybody, if you want to think about doing that, here's how you do it. You choose an event in your life that eats your heart out and has never been resolved. I swear we all have those. Some are little tiny things. And you think about it and you wonder what happened and why things went wrong. And you write about it and you have started a memoir. If you're not that interested in so great a self-examined life, you can write about other events in your life, and in the end, that don't cause you such agita. And in the end, you will not have a memoir, but you might have an autobiography or a chronology of your life, or bits and pieces of your life. All of them will be a grand treasure to anyone who comes after you. Finally, I wanted to, one last thing. Kind of a page and a half here of a work in progress, a new memoir. Okay, so here I go, and I'm going to ask you something at the end, okay? An estuary is a contained coastal body of water with thin streams from higher land merging with its flow, forming a transition zone between river and maritime environments with a free connection to the open sea. I live along the shore of such a body of water, Estero Bay, on a barrier island, also named Estero, that leaves just enough room at either end for our bay's free connection to the Gulf of Mexico. I moved to the island 3 years ago when my husband and I made the decision to run away to the beach and never come back, just like the poster says. On my first night in our new home, in the pitch dark, I took the boardwalk trail behind our cottage through a preserve that dead ends at a little fishing dock. No one was there. I leaned on the dock's railing and rested my elbows on its smooth, dark foot. The bay's waters were placid, and the few navigation lights marking anchored boats shone as steady pinpricks of light. The evening sky over the silhouette of land on the other side of the bay was still pale, though it was hours after sunset. I gazed at that sky growing paler yet until the edge of the moon inched up above the shadowy mainland to produce a trembling silver trail straight across the surface of the water and onto my bare arms. Mother Nature's welcome was worth the trauma of moving 1,500 miles from Connecticut to, God help me, Florida. And then I'll jump to the end of that chapter. Our home by the preserve has proven to be an oasis. My virtual son-in-law pointed that out. He said, between the bridge and your cottage and getting here, this heavy traffic, people running in and out of cars to get from one bar to another, and all those girls in the world's skimpiest bikinis would do me in. But here we are, and he gestured to the air around us. Swaying palm trees, the blue sky, this intimate little swimming pool within the preserve that we have, and the nonstop bird song beside. You and Charlie live in an oasis. It was true. And other than the bird song and the background murmurs of nature, the engaging swish that swaying palms produce, I have never experienced the slightest disturbance in my oasis, except for one time. My daughter-in-law and I, she and my son, our first visitors, were sprawled on lounges at that little 1950 pool, enjoying a couple of gin and tonics, compliments of Charlie, when we were distracted by a woman, or perhaps a smallish man, in boots and a safari suit, complete with pith helmet, emerging from the preserve not 10 feet away from us. She parted the mangrove roots and stood there in the muck, framed by a jungle. In the same hushed words, Diane Cannon spoke when she saw Peter Sellers approaching in revenge of the Pink Panther, Sellers disguised as Quasimodo. Kim whispered to me, something is coming. Kim has those big green Betty Davis eyes, and if you catch her stare, it's penetrating, which is what caused, I'd say, the pith-helmeted stranger to slip back into the mangroves to be immediately swallowed up by the strands of strangler figs, gumbo limbo trees, slash pines, and many other fearfully named species of flora, all with vines and Spanish moss hanging and pendulating ominously from their branches. Soto voice like Kim and Diane, I leaned into her and said, it's Swamp Thing. But she leaned into me concerned, I hope it doesn't get strangled. I said, or slashed. Then I asked her, you ready for another Swamp Thing? No, another gin and tonic. She said, hope for her empty glass. Yes, I certainly am. All right, so here is my question for you. I wanted to end on a note of a little bit of foreboding. So I ended with, she leaned into me, I hope it doesn't get strangled. I said, or slash, end of chapter. And then I thought, well, maybe that's a little giving too much foreboding away. Maybe the foreboding should be a little lighter than that. And so then I added the drink, the swamp thing in the toast. I would like a vote. I would like you to help me as I progress through the process of writing memoir. How many people think I should stop at, I said, or slash? We have 3. And do the rest of you want me to add the rest of those lines? All right, so Jenny said, I think add the lines. I'm going to add this slash. Because you miss the whole middle, you know, and I think it's very positive and good and happy, but I have to get in that something awry. Okay, so now we get to ask and answer questions, because I guess I finished with my piece. Did I go more than 40 seconds?
That was perfect.
I didn't even look at the time. She said 45 minutes. So, yes, ma'am.
I think you should end with slash, because I raised my hand for that, but I really think the rest of that was so funny, you've got to put it somewhere.
That's very nice. Yeah, I think maybe I'll have a little baby flashback. Kim, do you remember that? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I love your book, and I was impressed at the magnitude both storylines of Irene's and of your family with brother and with your aunts and mother. And I wonder if it's very equal with your life.
I think, again, because this was the 50s, something horrible happened and you were told to stop thinking of it, and I did. And so it didn't carry as much weight, even though I divided it in half as best I could, as my family and my brother and growing up in those days. But now it does. Now it does. And when I went back and looked at the book, I think I really did give it a equal weight. That was my effort. And the other thing was structuring this book, because, you know, I've had, you know, Wally Lamb. I was asked to review your book, and it's so crushing. And it's hilarious. So you go from one to the other, and to try to review this, it was next to impossible, but I did my best. I said, you did great. So much. So, yeah, in the end, my goal was to give it equal weight, but more important to me was the structure of it, how I was going to do that, and have the murder and the 50s ethnic family. You know, my mother had 12 brothers and sisters amongst them, and my father 9. And so this was a huge, huge family. Oh, the food, you know? So, so then I'm writing about this killer, and he was born in California. And how did he end up in my little neighborhood, 3,000 miles away, and kill my friend? And so then it dawned on me, I'm going to follow him as to how he came, where he was born, to where he went next, and do the impossible, which was write the chapter about my family life, stop it, and write a page, sometimes as short as 3 paragraphs, usually very short, of him coming closer and closer and closer to this act of random violence hit. And that was halfway through the book. And after the halfway point, then I was a grown-up, not a little girl anymore. and I was writing this story, this memoir. So,
I have a question from Zoom.
oh,
So with all that you've experienced growing up with your brother and Irene's death, when you look back, who or what do you believe influenced you to manage your life experiences and challenges to bring you to where you are today?
can you read that all over again? I started thinking about that first part, answering that, but it's more complicated.
Yeah, so
on.
right, so the question, and I'm looking on Zoom at the person who asked this convoluted question, but all the thing you experienced when you were growing up, which you were just talking about, when you look back on all of that,
Mhm.
who is it or what is it that you believe influenced you in how you manage your life experiences and the challenges of that and have to bring you to where you are today?
The greatest influence was my father. My father would do things like go on a business trip and bring me back as a gift bookends, which I loved because my books were falling down. He read a story to me or recited a poem every night. And it was, my bedtime stories were, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty and distant. So all of that literature and poetry influenced me. And then he brought me to the local library, the Goodwin branch in Hartford, now no longer with us, even though I wrote a letter to the Hartford. So there are so many children in that neighborhood. How can you demolish? And I said, all of you insurance companies out there, go fund this library. Don't take it away. So that's it. So anyway, he took me to the library when I was 6, and I learned to read, and introduced me to the librarian, and said, and she took me to the children's room. I got the little tour, and every week I went with him to the library. He'd get Tyler's books, and I could pick 3 books. It wasn't long before this librarian broke the rule and let me have 6. And then she broke the rule when she saw me trying to sneak out an adult book. I'm probably 10 around now. And she said, we have the young adult books, Marianne, and you know, these are the ones for you. I said, I read them all. Everything's merged. Didn't do a lot for me. And so she said, all right, you can pick books from the adult section, but I have to okay them. And she didn't have to go through all that extra trouble. Look at the book I picked out. She didn't necessarily read it and say, yep, you can have that one, but you can't have these 2. When you're 18, come back. Kids today, you know, I wrote my first novel, The Book of Phoebe. I didn't think anybody under 16. 9-year-olds were sending me letters about what a great book it was. And you're writing about my big sister. That's who you're writing about. You know, so kids today, and I've gone into 2nd grade classrooms for each of my grandchildren and done a poetry section. These kids are brilliant. They're freaking geniuses. They know so much. It's unbelievable. Their knowledge of poetry. And I recognize their teachers who would invite me back to second day, special days. And Jenny's youngest, Christopher, is the same one who did the video with Governor Lamont. It was their exploration day. They'd studied all the explorers. So here's the teacher dressed as Queen Isabella, the crown, the gown, everything. And each kid was an explorer, and each one got up, told what he explored. This is 2nd grade. The country he explored, he knew it inside out. I never could keep one explorer straight from the other, you know? So children just so impress me with the education they get, how seriously they take it, and of course, the teachers' aides that are available in the classroom to help those kids out who can't sit still in a chair. And I taught kindergarten and for 4 years, and I recognized children who couldn't sit still, and I made a deal with them that they didn't have to sit in a chair. They had to have one knee on it. And that's all they needed. They were happy again. You know, they would do a do-si-do around the chair before the knee there was put on the floor. So it's just a long way from all the memorization we did, and all, you know, it's wonderful. Children are very fortunate today. How in the world did I get off? I hope you're Zoomer.
You did, and the follow-up was, who gave you your sense of humor?
Same man. Yes. He was a riot, wasn't he? Was one of the funniest. And you know what he did once? We had relatives in Italy who my family kept in touch with because my grandfather came over here and circumstances not like most immigrants. He was anti-fascista and his family had to get him out of Italy before he was killed. And he came and then he sent for his girlfriend, and so they ended up settling here. So back in the day, there was a dialect in every, what was an individual state in Italy. And so, and my father used to imitate their border. In the Depression, anybody on an attic had a border. And he used to go to the movies every Saturday, and he'd come home and sit all the kids around, and in the dialect, tell the story of the movie. And my father could speak that dialect too, and Piedmontese. And I wish I could, and I wish I could give you a few lines, even if I couldn't. But my cousin, maybe second cousin, he was a mathematics professor, and he got an exchange program at Johns Hopkins, and that math teacher went to Italy. So he came to Hartford to visit all of us. So my father decided to tell the story of the border. And then my father starts speaking in this dialogue, and it's a lot of, you know, and the guy slips out. He said, no one knows this dialect anymore. No one in Italy speaks this dialect. I have to come back with a tape recorder and take you and bring it to the library. So everybody's okay, fine. So my father comes and he goes, well, when my father did it the first time, he had a couple of pops, you know. So he was all loosened up. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He was mortified to speak into the tape recorder. So anyway, we introduced this cousin of ours to some other American cousins who could speak the dialect and who weren't shy about speaking into this tape recorder. So I don't even know. But I have to say, the great comedy writer and great historical writer and great poet William Shakespeare was my greatest influence. I went to Central Connecticut. I took Shakespeare as an English major with a retired Ivy League professor. And that was the benefit of going to Central Connecticut. We had these teachers, these professors who retired and they got farms, you know, and then they got bored. And then they came and taught at the state colleges. And he just blew me away. He was such an expert. And he said, everything you want to know is in Shakespeare. Shakespeare invented motive. Until Shakespeare, there was no motive for action. He invented motives and he came up with it. And I just really ate it all up. I always go back to Shakespeare.
That's great. Another question, oh, yeah, please. Yeah, definitely.
Yes, well, when I got back from the Peace Corps, I took my only writing class. And it was with Paul Brodeur, the wonderful New Yorker writer. He also wrote the book on asbestos. He wanted to write a memoir. So he rented a house in rural Connecticut with peace and quiet. You don't want peace and quiet when you've worked in the New Yorker offices. It didn't work for him. So he taught a class at Fairfield, and I signed up for his class. So I got there to his first class, and he wants to be anywhere else, but he had to do something. I found this out later. So he's got these papers, all the stuff he asked that we submit. And you could tell he never read them until that moment. and then he's got to one, and we're waiting, and finally he goes, "Who's Mary Ann?" I looked around hoping there was another class. And I went like that. He said, "Come out in the hall." I thought, this teacher is now going to beat me up. How bad was my piece of writing? So he went out and he said, "You have real estate." And I'm thinking he's renting a house and I own a house. Yeah, what the man was talking about. And he looks at the paper and he said, "You lived on an active volcano." Yes. And as you put it, in the armpit of West Africa. Yes. He said, "Write about the armpit, make up the people who live in the armpit, and write it, and don't stop writing it until you have, at the minimum, a short story. But as you've submitted a short story that I'm looking forward to reading, go for a novel. You've got everything you need for a novel." And the Peace Corps was the real estate, you know? So, and I started writing about, on my first novel, I was on Mount Cameroon, which is a former German colony, and my first novel was a thriller. And it was about a Nazi who made his way back to Cameroon because his father was the colonial governor, and he hid on Mount Cameroon. And so I got the best rejections, nice rejections. One editor said, "You know, you're a writer, but you haven't worked it all out yet. If I were you, I wouldn't try to write something commercial, which is what you tried to do. I would try to write something you want to write." And that was the best advice I could have gotten. I've since written a thriller that I wanted to write, and I used a lot of stuff in that first novel in other novels. So the Peace Corps actually has something like 300 published writers. And, you know, here we lived in very exotic corners of the world. And we were away for 2 years. You know, you learn to live the life. And JFK knew what he was doing. He could have sent us over for 3 months, you know, and it never would have been the same. So, so we have Paul Theroux, and we have so many writers who wouldn't have been writers, all of them said if they hadn't been in the Peace Corps and gotten the real estate. So yeah, it's huge. Yes.
I have a question about timing. Were covered. Was it your professor who said you could use
Right, we had to write 100-page autobiography. Central Connecticut does an interesting thing. If you're a psychology major, you write 100-page book about yourself. That meant we had 3 people left in the program. It was class. And so he said to me, you know, you're writing about your retarded brother, and it's wonderful and it's interesting. Marianne, your minor is psychology. Can retarded people read and have 2,000 books of physical library? And I said, no. And he said, I suspect your brother is autistic and had only recently been described and diagnosed. So he told me what autism was. I said, yeah, today that would have been Asperger because he was obsessed with World War II and had every book ever written on it. Go ahead. My mother.
Oh, really?
Yes. He knew that he was trying to read. So he sent away to the Calvert School where you could teach your children at home. There was homeschooling long before we thought there was homeschooling. So the big trouble was me because I wanted to learn to read too. So I had to take the Calvert lessons with my brother. So I was reading when I was 3. She must have been an awfully good patient teacher. So she taught him to read, she taught him math, and it wasn't easy. And we couldn't help but be very close to him because we were his tools. He couldn't survive without us doing things for him that he couldn't do. And he had obsessive compulsive behavior that was just extraordinary. And one of the things he had to do was do everything 3 times. He had to do everything 3 times. Every food he ate, there had to be 3 of each thing. And one time, so sad, he tripped over a curb. On the back of a curb, he had to trip and land on the road 2 more times. So then, when my father something was going on with him, and he ended up with Alzheimer's, and it was time to find some place for Tyler. And my father had always said to me, we know, Marianne, that you'll find a good Catholic home for him. I would? How in God's name was I going to do that? I didn't know. So at the same time, we had a lot of fun with Tyler. We went to G Fox one day, and Tyler gets in the elevator and takes command. And I'm with him because I'm the adjutant. We're fighting World War II. And he's going up and down in that elevator. And so my father, who wasn't watching us very carefully, he's talking to his friend, the painter at Chief Fox. And he sees this and he gets the painter and he said, we got a big problem. What? He's Tyler and Marianne are in the elevator, they're going up and down. So his name was Lukey Welch. I called him Daddy Welch. And Daddy Welch went and got a big 2x4. He said to my father, can these kids take a bump on the noggin? My father said, sure. And they stuck this 2x4 between the floors and bang, and we hit the roof. But we were fine. My father was saying, it's a hot fudge Sunday for you guys when you get out, you know. It was punishing us or something. So we got out and you know, Tyler made sure we went to get the hot fudge sundaes, and he said, okay, Tyler, don't tell your mother. My brother, okay. I told my mother. You did what? So we had a lot of fun adventures, I have to say. And I love Tyler very much, and I miss him terribly. I mean, we're in side-by-side bedrooms, and I used to get up in the middle of the night and get in bed with him and tell him stories. And then once in a while, I'd say, Tyler, it's your turn to come and tell me a story. He'd sneak over, because if my parents heard us, they'd say, took those lights out and go to bed, you two. And he'd come over and I'd say, tell me the story of Cinderella. That was just a little kid. Well, there was this prince, and he was looking for a girl, and one of them had glass shoes, and so he said, whoever fits the glass shoe, that's who I'm going to marry. And so she had two sisters. They were bad sisters. And so they wanted to try on the shoes too. And they would make the shoes fit. And so the prince tried the shoe on the first sister. Failure. Then he went to the second sister. Failure. And then he went to the third sister. Boom. The slipper went on. Success. The end. So you left a lot out. So he, my mother took him to Boston Children's Hospital when he was 5 and said, my son can read. And people are telling me he's retarded, and I don't think he is. And so, I think he was 3. And so this doctor said to her, I suppose he can tie his own shoes. Well, here was my mother, stands up, walks out. Meanwhile, my father is trying to say, he's in the waiting room. My son is in the waiting room, and he's reading Churchill's diaries of World War II. Well, now the doctor thinks my father is out of his mind, and that was kind of the end of it. They tried early on to find something for him. And then as he got older, he didn't have the drugs that were available to kids like him. And he had a very strong sex drive when he was about 14, as do all autistic children. But today, they take anti-libido kind of drugs to keep their sex drive in check. And so my parents had to watch him like crazy. I mean, he would try to have sex with a dog, and this was all in my book. And so, and I had to watch him too, watch Tyler. I said, okay, I know what I was watching him for. I was playing Monopoly and Crazy 8 with him. And so then I did a book signing. It was with my son for the Red Sox book. And we had a long, long line. It was at the Javits Center. It was really exciting. And so there was a couple of people hanging out. And the last person in line, and they put a velvet rope. You couldn't get in line because now we're packing up and you go to the next writer. It's amazing. So this woman said to me, my son is autistic. Now, just because your brother had a sexual nature, not all autistic children do. And this is an insult to my son because he would never behave the way you described your brother behaving. And I said to her, well, I wasn't speaking for your son, but I'm sorry I've offended you, blah, blah, blah. And she said, all right. And she left. And then her friend came up and said, that poor kid is on every drug known to man to keep him calm and to put his sex drive in check. I said, thank you, I thought it was me. So, did I answer your question? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned your mother a couple of times,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about her. She was the first person that we talked about in the book club, and people have strong feelings. But I have a question.
Right.
So
Sure. Okay. So, my mother couldn't stand me. And this is often happens when the first child has serious problems and illnesses or whatever. The next child's supposed to be perfect, because you don't have anything wrong with you. And I wasn't perfect. And she would say to people, 12 years old, and it's Easter dinner. We go to somebody's house, and my slip is showing. My slip is showing, my nail. Oh, I had greasy, oily hair, And my mother would say in front of everybody, Marianne is such an embarrassment to me. I don't know why I take her anywhere. Now, when all is said and done, do you know what people have told me? Your mother falls in the autism spectrum. She had no feelings. That's interesting. All right. So And it's not to say she didn't have a good side, but she just had autism. And she would knit all the time. Knitting kept her sane with my brother. And people, if she was here and she was wearing a sweater, and you said to her, "Oh, did you make that?" And she'd say yes, and you'd say it's beautiful, because they always were. She'd find out your address and she'd send you a sweater. She'd send you not that sweater, she'd make one for you. She was the most generous person, but not of heart. There was something else going on there. So it was very, very hard, obviously. My mother never kissed me. She never hugged me, ever, 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 you know? So ask Jenny. I'm all over my kids. They got more zillions and trillions of hugs. And my mother did not get up for breakfast. She slept. So I'm 7 years old, sucking on a can of Hershey's syrup for breakfast as I run out the door. My poor kids had to have French toast, scrambled eggs every morning when they didn't leave without the scrape. That I sat down and had breakfast with them. So maybe those things led me to being a much better mom than I might have been, you know. But I was very comforted once I started hearing so many people saying she was definitely. Yeah. You know, I did a book club at the Stetson Library in New Haven. And it's nice now, but it was very run down. It's in the ghetto. And I had all these African-American women who'd been there were 15 of them. They'd had a book club going for 10 years. I was their 10th anniversary speaker. They wrote every single book they talked about, and they took turns doing a little précis of the pros and cons. And at the 10 years, they had a book made for each of them, discussing their discussions of all those books. And they were saying to me, you know, we admired your mother for a lot of things. She knew she had to get out of that house, so she did. She was an athlete, and so she played golf. She was in a bowling league. And if she hadn't done things, she'd have lost her mind, you know? So you were hard on her, and we understand that, but she did what she had to do. And I wanted you to know that all of those women came to that meeting in their Sunday best, in their beautiful suits, great hats, thank God. And they were wonderful. And guess what? Those women made every single item of food that I described, including banya calda, which most people pronounce Magna Carta. Talk about it. That was the most wonderful time I've had with readers. They were amazing.
One more question and then we'll wrap up.
I would like to know what influenced you to go to preschool.
JFK offered to send me a ticket to some country far away, and I grew up with a viewmaster. Many of you remember viewmaster? You looked the whole world through your viewmaster. I couldn't wait to see the world. So at the same time, my nuns in my Catholic CYO classes said over and over, there are people who don't have the opportunities you have, and you must do something about that. And I took that to heart, and the Peace Corps just came along. And so I didn't know much about it, but I went to the University of Hawaii summer session after my junior year of college because I broke up with my high school boyfriend. We were engaged. And when I broke up with him, my father said, you know, back in the old country, you take a trip. He thought I would go to London. You know, I went to the University of Hawaii. So there was a gang of people around my age, and they're playing volleyball. And they invited me to play. And then they had a barbecue. They were the coolest people I ever met. they were training to go to the Philippines as Peace Corps volunteers. And then I thought, you know, I'm gonna do this. So I got back home, I filled out an application, and I got an engraved invitation from Sergeant Schreiber. He knew how to set a tender trap. And guess where I trained? Columbia University for 3 months. To go from Central Connecticut to Columbia, every teacher was an expert in his or her field. It was, and we learned, here I thought I was gonna learn a foreign language. I learned the trade language of West Africa. It's a language that everyone can speak, no matter what country it is, so that they could trade and understand each other. And that was the language I learned, and it was really fast. I used it a little in one of my books. So yeah, that's what did it.
I just was wondering, maybe was it a wish to escape
It
your
wasn't.
home life?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It wasn't. I was old enough to go, but it was never an escape. And my family was very excited. And we were looking for Cameroon. We didn't know where it was. It was in the crack in the encyclopedia. There it was. And then everyone was afraid to tell my grandfather. Here's my grandfather, the anti-fascista, who came over in a freighter to escape Italy. And so finally, they told him at this party for me. It was my graduation from college, and they told him. You know what he said to me? They grow good grapes in Cameroon. They grow good grapes. So he knew about the vine.
I think that's it. I think we should end on that wonderful note.
Okay. Grapes in Cameroon.
Grapes in Cameroon. Thank you so much for
Thank you
doing
for
this.
having
Thank you
me.
so much.